I guess I would just like to say for all the listeners that this is definitely a companion episode of the Reef Therapy Sessions podcast to a marathon 2-hour tour of the Reef Builder studio that Mark just went through.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about all the systems, and I really tried to address it since I'm a viewer as well, a remote viewer, right, back on the East Coast, and seeing the studio through the eyes or lens of YouTube. I really am glad that we went through and did such a thorough tour, but at the same rate, it's amazing that really we just covered really some of the just great points about every tank or interesting points, and it still took us hours. We really didn't deep dive. There's still so much more that we could have discussed that we left on the table.
There was a lot left on the table. That is definitely one way to put it. I always have to look around and count how many tanks we're up to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There's about 20 tanks here. We'll just call it a nice round 10 reef aquarium displays. And if you've ever seen like a decent 2 or 3 foot tank, you can sit around one of those with a reef buddy of yours and, you know, chew the cud for half a day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm staring at these 4 innovative marine tanks next to your mangrove display. And any one of these tanks we could spend an hour just sitting in front of with a beer, chatting it up.
Yeah, you know, what's really interesting is like the last 2 years I've really been like shoring up the engine, right? The mechanics of the aquarium itself. And now I'm to the point where almost everything is super dialed in. And the only thing left to do with some of these tanks is curation. Mm-hmm. Like where does which coral go next to another one? Getting a little bit more sophisticated with my flow programs. My lighting programs always start, I mean, I have a pretty good template for how to do the lighting, but the flow is something I've been getting to become a little bit more dynamic throughout the day.
That was a question I didn't ask on the video, but I think you just answered it, was as we were going through these tanks, if any of these tanks were in my house, I mean, obviously there's always room to grow out corals further. There's always room to prune and build new things. But I feel like a lot of these tanks are in a really nicely mature spot. Now, I was going to ask you, actually on the video, but I didn't, was do you feel like you're transitioning into a new phase, right? It's not so much the buildup of the reefs, but you mentioned the word curation, right? Obviously, there's more to build. I mean, we talked about that mega tank over there. Yeah. There's more, and I mean, you've got plenty of room to set up even more systems if you wanted to. But it's just, for me, it's also interesting to see, and I don't know, we talked about this with Planet tanks. A lot of Planet guys will reboot their systems every once in a while, right? Yep. And you have the opportunity to do that because you have places that, okay, this coral doesn't fit my vision for this tank anymore. I've got 19 other tanks I can move that coral to, so you always have that opportunity. But do you feel like you're in a different phase from, or have you been in that phase for a while? I don't know.
You know, so when I first started up the studio, I set up a bunch of tanks, and for, I mean, until now, I'm still like in that coral acquisition phase, right? I'm still like, in my mind, I'm like, I need to collect them all, right? I want to have the living catalog of all the corals. And periodically, like, I don't know, maybe every 9 months, I will give myself a suspension of like 3 to 4 or 5 months. Be like, all right, now's the time to make sure every coral's in the right place. Make sure it is on display, because you know a lot of the corals, they go in the coral flats first as they're kind of maturing and settling into aquarium life. And one of the biggest challenges, you know, is even with like a single group of coral, very few corals grow in proportion with each other, right? Even if you have different rates. Man, and even if you had like 10 of the exact same, or you know, 10 watermelon chalices from the wild, you know that 2 of them are gonna just grow like crazy. 5 or 6 of them are gonna grow like normal, and 2 of them are gonna stagnate, right? Same thing with zoanthids, right? I think Nirvana is one of those zoanthids that goes gangbusters. what's another one? The Rastas go crazy, and then some other strains just might, sit there and look at you before they really settle in and grow very well. So it's trying to balance that out across the LPS corals, across the bubble corals, across the Montiporas, the Euphyllias, the assorted, medium polyp colonies and stuff. And that's probably even worse with the soft corals, because like one soft coral will grow like a literal weed, where some others will just sit there and look at you. So I'm definitely at the point now where it's like, all right, I got enough coral, but where do they need to go to be best presented?
Makes sense, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we talked a bit about it on the video, and it's probably something that you're used to being in this space, but I still think it's so cool that you have the ability to place the same coral in so many different environments with so many different light and flow situations and see differences. Like, that's got to be, I think the information derived from that over time's got to be significant, right?
It's so informative, right? Because like, all right, perfect example is my pink Alveopora. I've kept it in high light, I've kept it in medium light, I've kept it in like a shaded bright light tank, and then I put a random piece in the very low light, like 40-gallon SPS or LPS tank, and it looks okay and good and grows in every one of those systems. But in the low light tank, it is what you hope Alveopora would look like, with extremely long, stretched out polyps, super pink tentacles.
Oh, yeah.
And if you have one tank and a couple zones, it's going to take you a lot longer than if you have 5 pieces of the same coral and multiple zones and multiple tanks.
Yeah, and maybe I think on one of the reef therapies, I disagreed with the assessment that mixed reefs are hard. I hear that a lot. And I think you also disagree. You are more of in agreement that mixed reefs are hard, perhaps. But
I believe that trying to keep every coral in the same kind of tank is the hardest thing possible.
Well, and I'm willing to walk back my statement on that, because I have successfully kept a lot of corals mixed together without problem. But now seeing how significant of a difference these corals can look like in different tanks, I can also see how a mixed reef is hard if your goal is to have every coral be in its peak color, peak example of what that coral should look like, right?
You hit the nail on the freaking
like.
head. Yes, you can keep a Welsophilia, Trachophilia alive in your Acropora tank. Is it going to look as good as if you keep it in a lower energy, cooler temperature, lower light, blue light, high nutrient environment? No way.
Yeah.
No freaking way. And I know you might get away with it for a year or two, but man, how many people do you know have had a Trachie most of their reef keeping career?
Not a whole lot.
Right? How many people have had a Blastomussa Well's eye for years and years and years, so much that they have to frag it out and give it away? Because, my Euphyllia tank is just so much easier. I have a tank full of Euphyllia. I can even smush some Galaxias in there.
Yeah, it's that tank in itself. I wish I didn't have so many issues. I don't have issues growing Euphyllias, but they sting the crap out of me. I don't know what it is about my skin type or whatever that I just kind of had to abandon ship on those guys. But looking at this tank, my gosh, it's just gorgeous. But yeah, it's a very fair point, right? Is that there's not a lot of good expert advice on there of like, this is the perfect ideal conditions for this coral. We used to think that there was. I always did.
Yeah, we did.
But it's when you have somebody like in your shoes with multiple systems to kind of poke and prod and try things out, it's like, well, how did they come to that conclusion, right? Alveopora, like looking at it from some of your SBS systems where you've got some of it of the same, and seeing that and I know we don't have video, hopefully we superimpose it, but seeing it in this low light tank of yours, it was a completely different coral to me. I thought it was a different coral.
Transformed.
Yeah.
I think one perfect case study is the Starmint Colastria that I've had for 20 years. You know, it looks the best in lower light. It's got the greenest mouth, the fluffiest polyps, and the brightest green stripes. But in the higher light kind of mixed reef tank, it grows way faster. Like way faster. It's not even close.
Yeah, so mine, I mean, we've passed it amongst each other for a very long time.
You still have the Starmint?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but I have huge, the brown with the white stripe piece is usually real fleshy and huge, and the green center is very small. And one thing I noticed in your systems is the center greens, which is really the pretty part, is much bigger. But then when you started talking about the differences, I had to kind of prop my head up and look at this tank, because I'm like, well, I bet you have an example of how it grows in my tank because you have it in so many different systems, right?
Yeah. No, that's one coral that's very strange that I have seen in like standing depth water, and I've also seen it at 100 feet. And in standing depth, it looks like a moon coral, super dense, tons of coral lights, big old colony. But the pieces that we're familiar with are bigger polyps, larger corallites, more color, more tissue, right? So if you had, let's say, a 4-inch piece in lower light, you might have 10 polyps, and a 4-inch piece in higher light, you might have 30.
Yeah.
You know, but so you take that kind of like that virtual experience across multiple different systems, and you really start to define the boundaries of some of these corals. And that's why I have I have 2 LPS tanks, 2 or 3 acro systems, and 1 dedicated euphyllia tank, and put some soft corals where I can.
Yeah, that, and I love the fact that, you know, in this age of hot corals, you have so many, I almost want to call them legacy corals
Yeah.
around.